Gentleman into Goose, being the exact and true account of Mr. Timothy Teapot Gent of Puddleditch in Dorset that was changed into a great grey gander at the wish of his wife. How, though a gander, he did wear breeches and smoke a pipe, how he near lost his life to his dog Tiger. You have also an account of his gallantries with the goose, very diverting to read, with many other surprising adventures, full of wonder and merriment, and a full relation of the manner of his sad, dismal end, worthy to be had in all families, for a warning to wives, and by all bachelors intending marriage. By Christopher Ward, with wooden engravings by C.W. and C.W. Jr., published and sold in New York by Henry Holt and Company. Made in Great Britain. The world is of late grown so skeptical of all relations of events that fall not within the common experience of mankind, that there is little credence given to any narrative pretending to discover happenings outside the usual occurrences of everyday life. For this reason, I have long withheld the disclosure to the public of the matters of fact herein set forth. It seemed to me that not St. Matthew, not St. Mark, not St. Luke, not St. John, no, not all four of them, were they risen from the dead, could induce the public to believe such a tale, but would be cried out upon the cozeners and cheats withal. But there having been published into late an history entitled Lady into Fox, where one, but lately commenced auteur, and no more to be believed upon, his own testimony than any other, hath set forth an account of a like occurrence, to the vast amazement and delight of his readers. I am emboldened to do the like, albeit I lack the art to dress this tale in such brightness and beauty as he hath been skilled to use in his narration. The sudden change of Miss Tebrick into a vixen was not one whit less strange than the turning of Mr. Teapot into a gander. Moreover, the latter is as well avouched, nay, I may say better. For while the ingenuous narrator of Miss Tebrick's story hath averred that it is attested by a dozen witnesses, but without naming any, no, not one, I can bring to witness a full score, naming each as this: Giles Hodge, an industrious hedger and ditcher, though some deal given to drink, who lives not above a dozen miles from Miss Teapot's house, and heard much of the event not so many years after it happened. Miss Tabitha Tittlebat of Diddlebury, hence, a generally sober and understanding gentlewoman and cousin german to Miss Teapot. Miss Tittlebat positively assured me that she had the whole matter of her kinswoman, who would not forge and tell a lie without reasonable occasion, being of as much honesty and virtue as most pious withal above the common run, and that Miss Teapot was but little in her cups at the time, having had not above 3 goes of gin, a small matter of brandy, and a few pints of stout, and many others. 'Tis true that there be those that doubt the verity of the tale, and will have it that no such miracle ever befell Mr. Teapot, but that was all a mystification put about by Miss Teapot to account for her husband's disappearance, he having left her in disgust of her person and her tongue, and gone his ways. But though this opinion hath been much cried up among her neighbours, it, being hearsay, shall not weigh against the testimony of one eyewitness, to wit, Miss Teapot herself. To our tale, then, and shortly be it said, without more ado, that Mr. Timothy Teapot was a gentleman by birth, of an original as high as anybody's, if royalty be disregarded, as is so much the fashion in these days. He was of kin to the noble family of Crockery, whereof the Earl of Supansweir is the head. Having been bred up very carefully by his mother, and always bid to remember that he was a gentleman, he was never used to any labour, nor to turn his hand to any employment, not so much as to earn a shilling of money in all of his life. Upon the death of his father, being a younger son, and his eldest brother taking all, he was so reduced in his fortunes that he was hard put to it to continue to live like a gentleman. Being in this strait, and casting about for some way out, he hit upon the ingenious plan of marrying a woman of fortune, and it so fell out that he chanced upon Miss Pamela Pickledish. This Miss Pickledish was the daughter of a city merchant, a maiden of upwards of 45 years of her age, and esteemed of good estate, having, so it was said, houses and lands and a good piece of money into the bargain. He found her not averse to wedlock, to which she said she had been many times solicited, but was too delicate in her choice to find a mate to her inclination hitherto. So, although she was of a sallow complexion, with a cast in her eyes and a mouth all out of proportionable dimensions with her face, in figure as lean as a lath and bony too, they were shortly married. Whether she was moved to her marriage with Mr. Teapot by belief that his fortune was equal to his station, as he had led her to believe, or by an affection to his person, or to his birth and lineage, or by a wish to escape from the mortification of a protracted maidenhood, in any case, her motive was but sane and reasonable, as you will allow, and such as moves most maidens. After their marriage, she soon discovered to him, in all honesty, that her pretended fortune was but a bite, and sought to cheer him by merrily quizzing him for a gull. Does it not seem hard, then, that her girlish frankness was requited by Mr. Teapot with such a confusion and outcry as would hardly be matched in Bedlam? Indeed, he fell into so great a rage as would have cost him his wits, had he any, crying out that he was had, that it was a piece of damnable roguery, and that he was catched by a sorry slut, and the like. But may it not be said for Mr. Teapot that he did no more than any gentleman would in such case? Indeed, he was as frank as she, and honestly told her that he had no estate nor money at all, no, not a stiver, and God knows, says he, how are we to live, for I have never been so base as to work in all my life, and never will, God helping me. When this hurly-burly was somewhat abated through Mr. Teapot being scant of breath, she turned roundly upon him and fairly outbawled him with her upbraidings. "Dost think," cried she, "that I have any better of the bargain with a husband such as thou? No, I han't. Any lusty beggar," says she, "could bring in more shillings in a day than thou in a month, nay, a year, I warrant ye. But what's done is done, and wisdom will make the best o' it. If thou'st a mind to live and not starve, it befits us to better contrive some way thereto, and cease this useless brawling and outcry." When the first transport of his rage was over, Mr. Teapot yielded to her will, and that weakly, whereby she had the upper hand in the affair, and so continued throughout their married life. Now so happily started upon this basis of mutual frankness, and with the wife in command. Left to her own contrivance, for Mr. Teapot forbore to struggle, and only sat silent and stared at the image of his misfortune, she was 20 times thinking what to do. At the last she found nothing more to her purpose than a little cottage she owned at Puddleditch in the country of Dorset, and thereto they retired, and made shift to keep from starving by raising fowls, ducks, geese, and the like. In this manner of living they went on for a good while, Mr. Teapot, being gently bred, and with more experience of elegance than she, many times sought to make up for the defects of her early education by explaining to her that her house was very meanly furnished by contrast with what he had been used to, that the food was not fit for a gentleman's table, that he had greatly condescended in marrying her when he had still a cast for an easy life by marrying a true heiress, and the like. More than that, he proved his gentility and his generous forbearance by eating what Miss Teapot set before him, like a good trencherman, whose heavy heart in no wise weighs upon his stomach, though with much grumbling. Moreover, he abated not his position as a gentleman by taking any hand in the work among the fowls, not so much as to cast upon the ground the corn for their feeding, but generously let his wife do all. His only preoccupations were the care of his person, wherein he was daintily particular, and the light duties of parish clerk, which he had been moved to undertake as being of a gentlemanly sort, and of providing means for the purchase of more beer and tobacco than his wife, in her care for his health, would allow him. On one of the first days in the year, Miss Teapot was busied among the fowls, while her husband leaned against the fence behind her, smoking his pipe and assisting his wife with advice as to the best manner of rearing poultry. Vexed, though unreasonably, by the sound of his voice in such case, "Teach your grandmother to suck eggs," she cried. "Do but look at him," she says to the fowls. "Do, pray, do! As great a goose as any in the flock, forsooth, as I wish he was in truth, aye, that I do." Thereupon she heard behind her a prodigious hissing, louder than she had heard in all of her life, and turned her eyes that way. Where her husband had been a moment before was a great grey gander, with a tobacco pipe in his beak, looking at her fiercely with angry eyes and hissing with great violence. You may well think if she were as astonished, and that to the last degree, and so maybe was Mr. Teapot at finding himself in this shape, with no speech but this new hissing, and no hands to take the pipe from his mouth, but must hold it there and hiss around it, so to say, or drop the dear pipe and break it perchance. She stared at him, bewildered, nor could stir one step, being as rooted in the ground, mazed by this dismal accident. Mr. Teapot, too, moved not but stood stock still, as held fast with a charm, and only arched his neck and turned his head a little this way and that, as he would try whether he was truly awake or dreaming, but without taking his eyes off of his wife. So they did nothing but only stare at each other for near 10 minutes. Then, seeing his difficulty with his pipe, he not being able to remove it from his beak, and fearing he might drop it and break it, which had cost 10 shillings of her money, she took it from him. At the same time, she sought with her other hand to touch his head and make sure this was no dream. But he would not have it so, and, turning his head aside, with a great ruffling of his feathers and a surly hiss, he strutted away with much dignity, fetching a long circuit about the yard, as if he did not well know what course to take. At the last he came safe into the cottage, where he got upon his own great armchair, arching his neck and looking about, as proud as any alderman, and prouder too. Now they were snug within doors, Miss Teapot and her gander husband. There was no one to peer and pry into their concerns, and to wonder why she should make such an ado about a goose. So the good woman gave way to her feelings. You may be sure she did. "Oh, my dear husband," cried she. "Oh, could I but have known that this strangest thing in all the world would have come to pass at my wishing it. It had been strange if I had not wished it long ere this. Thou'rt undone indeed, but so am not I too. For have I not to my flock one fine great gander more, and it shall be hard if thou dost not profit me greatly when I pluck thee, with all thy fine feathers." And so with much more of the same sort. It being now tea-time, and she having lost none of her appetite under this stroke of good fortune, she bustled about getting the tea ready, though she ceased not congratulating herself meanwhile. As was her custom, and not bethinking herself of the change in her husband, though all the while talking about it, she set the tea for two. Then she saw that though she had a new gander, she still had her old husband too, for he made way with the bread and butter as fast as before. But with the tea in his teacup he was not so handy, splattering and spluttering it all over the cloth, for all the world like a pig in a trough. When he had done, nothing would answer but that he should have his smoke, as he signified to her by tapping with his beak upon the tobacco jar and fumbling his pipe about with it. So Miss Teapot mustn't fill his pipe and put it in his beak and hold him a match, so that he could puff himself a light, all of which was done to his satisfaction at last. Although he was something impatient with her woman's way of stuffing the bowl and all. So he lay back in his great armchair, puffing away, extremely well satisfied, it seemed, in spite of everything, as why should he not be with a full stomach and his pipe drawing as well? But all this enforced upon her mind the strange new condition in which she found herself with a goose husband, who is not all goose nor all husband, if there be any distinction to be drawn between the two. When bedtime came, she wondered much what he would do for sleeping, whether he would take to their bed or no. But not so Mr. Teapot. There was no doubt in his mind. He waddled across the floor and jumped into bed with great flapping of wings, setting himself down in his accustomed place. Hardly had his head touched the pillow, but he was sound asleep and so remained throughout the night, nothing different than before, though without that mighty snoring for which she had so often awakened him with the point of her elbow in his ribs. In sooth, the night was passed to Miss Teapot's great content, who found a warm, soft, well-feathered goose indeed a comforting bedfellow in a cold night, and no grabbing of more than his share of bedclothes either, nor rolling over with them and leaving her bare and cold into the bargain. In the morning, too, it was not, "Wilt thou ever get up, thou lazy pig? Art thou going to sleep all day?" Not so for, whereas Mr. Teapot had been wont to lie abed until the kitchen was well warmed and his breakfast on the table, so that he might not hinder her in her work now, forsooth. He was up betimes, and before she was too. Missing the warmth of his feathered body and hearing the soft flap-flap of his webbed feet on the bare floor of their chamber, she opened her eyes to see Mr. Teapot lugging to her a pair of breeches in his beak, and making as though he would put them on, but could not, whatever he could do. The breeches were much too great for Mr. Teapot in his new shape, and though she was minded to do what he wished as never before, to save herself she knew not what outcries and violence, she would not spoil a good pair of breeches that might be apt for a second husband by cutting them short. The end of the business was that she contrived a little pair out of one of her old petticoats of a red and black checkered pattern. His breakfast she set forth upon the table, but not before she had spread upon it an oilcloth, whereby she should befoul the linen not at all. She put it in a great basin, too, for greater security and the saving of trouble. It was a sight indeed to see this great gander sitting in a chair, his long neck outstretched, plying his beak and making great play with his victuals, bacon and eggs and bread and such like, all mingled in the basin. Aye, and to see him thrusting his beak into his pint pot of small beer, whereof Mr. Teapot had always drunk his fill at his breakfast, and draining it dry too, as belike no goose had ever done before in all the world. So then, breakfast done and his pipe alight, he took his place back to the fire and legs apart, as he had been wont to do, puffing heartily at his pipe, all in his proper manner, and Miss Teapot, seeing all as usual, went about her household work, her care of the fowls and all, as though nothing had happened out of the ordinary. But when these were done at last, and she had time to think over the matter, she was at first under a great concern, indeed utterly confounded with the difficulty she was in. And in this, it would seem, she was in the wrong, for, all said and done, there was no such great change as she worried herself by thinking. Mr. Teapot, in his new state, was not so greatly different than before, when the matter is rightly considered, and the items of difference showed a balance rather to the good. Feathers he had instead of men's clothing, but these he grew for himself, at no cost, and wore with no trouble for putting off and on. His new webbed feet needed no shoon. His neck was longer than before, which gave him better play with his head, and thinner, which perchance would save him from the apoplexy to which he before seemed destined. And sure, his new face, with its fine aquiline beak and clear, sharp-seen eyes, was some deal more handsome than his former countenance. So much for his body, then. And as for the inside of his head, his brains may have been better or worse, no one could say which, for as he had no speech, how could anyone tell whether his thinking was wiser or not so wise as Mr. Teapot's has been? To be sure, it must be allowed that in his goose brain there could have been none of that faculty for wise and reasonable thought, with which the Creator hath endowed men only, and by which all their actions are determined and guided, and not by passion, prejudice, habit, caprice, and such like unreasons and whimsies, nor by the instinct, as in the case of animals and birds. Yet, the marvel of it is that in no respect nor matter whatever did this gander at any time demean himself, nor act so that one could say, "Ah, how different to Mr. Teapot." His reasoning mind would not have prompted him to do thus, and so, as this silly goose is now doing. This is, I say, marvelous, and must be left to wiser heads than mine to explain. To say the truth and do justice, Miss Teapot, there was one matter in which might well give her concern, and it was this with which her mind was now for the most part engaged. Whether the change was indeed to be lasting, her husband remained a gander throughout his whole life. This she knew not, and well might she be troubled on this account. It might be, thought she, that as this came so suddenly upon him, so quickly it would come about that he was a man again. But in this matter of the suddenness of the change, is it possible that she was at fault, and that it was in sooth gradual, beginning at the time when he first considered wedlock, and only culminating on a sudden? This I leave to the candid reader. However, with this fear in her mind, she would look away from him for a space, and then, on a sudden, turn her eyes upon him, as if to surprise him in the act of changing to his old form. Times, too, she went forth from the house, carefully closing the door behind her to keep him within, and would creep around to a window and peer in to watch him unawares for any sign that he was aught but a gander, in very truth, even when he thought no one was spying upon him. But all to no purpose, for there he was, a gander indeed to the very last feather and naught else. Only in this pipe smoking of his did he do anything but what both men and geese alike are wont to do. At the last, still in doubt whether to trust the permanence of the new condition, she made up her mind to treat him as gently as could be, within reason, and satisfy all his mannish desires and whims for so long as a time as would prove to her that he was to stay as he was. For, thinks she, if I do not do so, and he turns into a man again, then I shall never hear the end of it, not in all my life. With this settled in her mind, she fell a-thinking about how much to her liking was this new state of affairs. With a man always about the house, having he no occupation nor employment to take him away from dawn to dark, and with him expressing an opinion about this and objecting to that, how could a woman manage a household in her own way, as is divinely appointed, without argument and bickering, which were trying enough, even though she had her own way in the end? But a gander now, even if he smoked a pipe and wore checker breeches, was another matter. Not a word from him, forsooth, and she would have them all, first as well as last. Then, too, Miss Teapot well knew all the ways of geese and ganders, and what to do with them. If they proved saucy, aye, that she did. If only she might be sure that he would not play her a scurvy trick by turning again, trust, Miss Teapot, indeed you might, to manage her husband to her liking. From this she turned her mind to other points of advantage. Mr. Teapot had been a great dandy in his time, before he had come so low as to live in such a small way. And while he had a great store of clothes, enough for 5 men in all conscience, yet he had begun to complain that they were sadly out of fashion. No gentleman, he says, could afford to be seen in them, even in this mud-hole of a village. I must to London, says he, to my tailor's, and that shortly. So she had a forecast of his calling for a round sum of money to deck and array himself to his liking, and that again and again. But now, look at him, thinks she, in his little checkered breeches, with no thought but that he is the fine little gentleman, as well dressed and fine as any. And when these were out, thinks she, there's more of that old petticoat, and no new breeches to be made of it, until I please. No, indeed, let him hiss for new breeches as he may. After that, it came into her mind that in other ways there would be greater content for her with Mr. Gander as her husband and not the fine gentleman she had before. Mr. Teapot had been of a finicking and genteel appetite, always calling for this and that, dainty pastry, Savoys, and the like. "Do pray, my dear Miss Teapot," he says, "to provide food fit for a gentleman, and not such garbage as is proper only for ducks or geese or the like." But now he ate what was set before him, and seemed to find it much to his gust, aye, that he did, gobbling and swilling it down like any hungry goose, I warrant you. "So," thinks she, "if this goes on, it will be hard if I have him not weaned from gentlemen's food, nay, from any food for human beings, and he shall eat goose food, and that to his content. But if not to his liking, then he may lump it, as the saying is, leave it to Miss Teapot to feed a gander." So, indeed, it proved, and for his Savoys and dainties, he furnished himself therewith from the duck pond in a fine fat frog or the like. Nor was it long before he found his little checkered breeches to be a dress contrary to nature, or at least contrary to his wife's ideas, which comes to the same thing in the end, and went about with his own proper feathers for his only covering, as was intended when God made geese. But in this matter of clothes, I am got ahead of my story, and of food too, for it was not all so at once, nay, not for some time, as you shall hear. But now we must come back to this first morning after the change, and Mr. and Mrs. Teapot in their cottage, as I have told, he smoking his pipe, and she thinking over the matter. It came into her mind that she must make her secret safe, at least until she should know whether this state of affairs was like to continue, and indeed, even then, for it was too strange a tale to tell. No one would believe it of her telling, forsooth, but would have it that she had made away with her husband by drowning him in the duck pond or the like, and she might find herself at the last in gaol and be hanged for the murder of her husband. But if anyone should believe that in truth Mr. Teapot had been changed into a gander, and that all in a moment, would they not hold her for a vile witch and drag her through her own duck pond, maybe, or in some other manner roughly entreat her? Aye, that they would, thinks she. And then, too, this wishing of husbands into geese might become a popular sport with women, and the supply of geese so much increased as to bring about a glut of feathers and a fall in the price thereof. So, to make all safe, she set about that day to spread it abroad in the village that Mr. Teapot was off to London on business of importance, whereby she not only kept her secret, but gained much credit among her neighbours for having her husband a man of weighty affairs. Shortly to tell of this business of secrecy, I may say that, though a woman, Miss Teapot held her tongue in the matter for a good while. It was not until years afterward, and long past the time of Mr. Teapot's sad and dismal ending, whereof you shall hear anon, that she ventured upon the relation of the truth. But now to her story again, and let it be said that Mr. Teapot kept within doors most of all that day, only now and again waddling to the door and sticking out his head and his long neck, peering this way and that, but always keeping within, as though afraid to go abroad in this fashion. And well he might be for one reason, if for no other, and that was his own dog, Tiger. This dog of Mr. Teapot's was always a bone of contention in their household. He was a surly cur indeed, and given to chasing the fowls, and would kill one if only he could catch it. Miss Teapot made great ado about this trick of his. "Why, sir," she would say, "how canst thou expect me to keep fowls, and by that means thee, into the bargain, if that wretched cur be not put away?" "I cannot do so," said she, "and either the dog or the fowls must go, and where wouldst thou be then?" "Why, where am I now, forsooth?" says her husband, "in a wretched hovel with a shrill scold for a wife, and not much worse off if I starved, for all I have to eat now. A gentleman must keep a dog," says he, "and will let me hear no more about it." And for all Miss Teapot had her way in most matters, she did not in this. But now Mr. Teapot, peering forth, could see this dear Tiger asleep outside. a sight not so pleasing to his gander's eyes as before when he was a man. So he ventured not forth, as I have said. But on the second morning of his ganderhood, he was more used to his new shape and not so strange in his feelings, and, for all that his wife had to fill and light his pipe for him, he seemed to forget he was not a man. It was his daily use and custom to go forth after his breakfast for his morning stroll and to whistle for his dog, who comes running to him and leaps upon him fawningly and follows him wherever he goes. So on this second morning, pipe well alight, he waddled out of the door and whistled. No, not whistled, for that he could not well do, but hissed, loud and sharp. Who then so surprised as Tiger to see this great gander come briskly to him with a challenge of a hiss? But surprised or not, this Tiger comes running, as was his wont, yet in a different fashion, you may be sure, for now he was after his favourite quarry of his, a fine big goose. And so he leapt, but not fawningly, no, not so indeed, but with far other intent. Judge then the feelings of poor Mr. Teapot when he saw this great tyke, mouth agape, horrid fangs barred to their work, eyes gleaming like balefires, come bounding to him like a lion to its prey. For now he well knew he was no man, nor master of this monster dog, no, but a poor silly goose, such an one as Tiger had often chased before, and that to its death sometimes, while he, Mr. Teapot, had cheered him on with a tally-ho, yoinks, sick 'em, Tiger, and what not other cries. Now what a consternation was he in, and how swiftly turned he in his tracks, and with what a terrible clutter and noise of cackling and gabbling did he make his way, as fast as he could well go, to the cottage door. But run as he might, and it was with no dignified and portly waddle that he went, you may well believe. I say, run as he might, Tiger was upon him before he had got within. Just as he reached the doorway, those horrid fangs closed upon his hinder end. Then, on a sudden, comes the goddess to the rescue. For Miss Teapot all this while was within, busied about her affairs, but could not fail to hear the terrible tumult of the fray. No, not if she was deaf as any post. To the doorway, then, in hot haste runs Miss Teapot, and just in time to see a monster dog fall upon his prey. What an uproar there was, mingled of the shrill outcries of the wife, the squawking and gabbling of the dear husband, and the snarling of the cur, enough to terrify the stoutest heart. Into the arms of his rescuer flies Mr. Teapot, flapping his wings like a great windmill and crying out after the manner of geese for his dear life. Throwing her arms about him, she hugs him to her bosom like any lover. Now is it pull Dick, pull devil, for the dog hangs on behind. For all she berates him and kicks him too, and sets back on his haunches, and will not let go, not he. So there was this tug of war with the poor Mr. Teapot for the rope, and he was like to be pulled in two. Now it fortuned that Miss Teapot had made the little checker breeches for her dear husband in haste, and without any certain knowledge how goose breeches should be cut, so they did not fit close, but were somewhat loose and baggy in the hinder parts. And it was in this slack part that Tiger had fixed his fangs, and not in the very body of Mr. Teapot. So that, with the pulling and howling, the cloth being old and weak in its fabric, the breeches gave way at last, with a great ripping and rending, and Tiger got, for all his pains, only after the part thereof, while Mrs. Teapot bore away with the victory, and her dear husband in her arms. When she had got him safe within, she must first mix him a good stiff grog, for he was like to swoon with the fright and terror, with the rough handling too. Then she set about ridding herself of this dog by means of a good bit of pounded glass wrapped in some shreds of meat. While she was doing this, she did not fail to tell her husband what she was about. "Prithee," says she, "canst tell what I am doing? Why, getting ready to poison that foul cur and make an end of him I am." "And what canst thou say to that now?" "Nothing, I warrant ye. For han't ye found out it makes a deal of difference whose ox is gored, as the saying is? Ay, that thou hast for all thou'rt a silly goose. thou with more sense than when thou wert a man, and with much other discourse of the nature, but of no great signification. But for all this rating, Mr. Teapot made no answer, but only sat surly in his great armchair, wherein he had taken refuge both for his ease and to hide his shame. Nor did he go about again until she had contrived for him another pair of breeches like the first, for he had not yet come to the time when by his wife's contrivance his nature was altogether changed to that of a goose, and his feathers were his only covering, without shame to him. As he came to his full ganderhood in the matter of clothes by degrees, and not all at once, albeit it was not long, so in other matters. On the first Sunday after his change, which fell upon a Tuesday, Miss Teapot saw him ill at ease as church time grew on. He walks to and fro in the little cottage, looks down at his breeches, stretches his long neck, and turns his head this way and that, and all the while cackling and gabbling in a low, complaining voice. In all acting as he lacked something, she could not at first tell what. Then it came to her that her husband was minded to go to church and do his duty as clerk, and thereto first to don his high linen collar as he was used to wear at such times. Now, indeed, she was in a pretty pickle. Up to this time, she had tried to content him when he wanted something to his ease, because, forsooth, she feared if she crossed him and so made his condition irksome, it might follow that by some effort to escape from it, he would change back to a man. And now she feared this more than ever before, as he seemed more intent on this desire than on any other. But what to do passed her wits. To church they could not go, it was plain enough, to walk up the aisle behind her gander husband in his little checker breeches, and he waddling on before, and to see him take his place as clerk, with his long neck craning here and there, and his beaked goose face looking so wise. I say, to do this was beyond the power of her imagining. For what would the vicar say? And the congregation, too. At the last, she bethought herself how she might put him off, and at the same time content him. She contrived for him a tall collar to the full measure of his goose's neck, out of stiff paper, which seemed to please him mightily, as, by his puffing out his breast and gabbling gently, she understood. Then she placed herself behind a table, as in a pulpit, with him beside her on a little stool, and there she read the service from her prayer book, Mr. Teapot cackling the responses in their proper place, as he should, and to his great satisfaction. So she got over this, and by the next Sunday it was all forgot, and this pious woman was not forced to repeat this sacrilege. But after the second Sunday of his absences from church, it began to be questioned about in the village whether they had lost their clerk, as by his long delay upon this pretended business in London, it was doubted whether, indeed, Mr. Teapot would ever come again, but had gone away for good and all. Says one, "Why, sir, could you expect a gentleman like Mr. Teapot, used to all the delicate softness of town life, to put up with our rough country ways, and he in that little college, so unlike the grand mansions as he was used to? And the ducks and geese," says another, gabbling and cackling and quacking like bedlam. "Enough to drive a body mad, say I. No, of a surety, Mr. Teapot was bred up in far other fashion, that he was." But for the most part, they would have it that he had enough to spare of his wife's company. That ugly, scrawny wife of his, said they, and a scold into the bargain, a harridan, forsooth. Nay, he's left her and found flesh more to his fancy, I'll warrant ye. This opinion got about so that she was much cried down in the village as a scold and what not. But all of this Miss Teapot bore in silence, keeping her secret, as I have said. In this, methinks, she showed a fortitude like that of the Spartan boy with the fox gnawing his vitals, her secret being likened to that fox, which truly gnawed not more sharply for its release than this other. In all of which Miss Teapot showed herself a woman far beyond the common rate, and indeed she was. But the story reached the vicar's ears at last, and this good man must look into the matter and find out the truth. Whether Mr. Teapot was coming again or no, to quiet the talk of the village and ease his own curiosity too. Thus it came about that one morning after all her work was done, she idly gazing out the window, who should she see but his nag, a-riding down the lane and to her college, it seemed. But the vicar himself, none other than he. Alack-a-day, what should she do? For there, tucked up in his armchair, was her gander husband, pipe, breeches, and all. What would the parsons think to see this strange sight, and how would it go about the countryside that, being left by her lawful spouse, she had set up this great bird in his stead, and taken this grey gander for her husband? They would think, forsooth, that she had lost her wits indeed, and set about shutting her close in a bedlam. But Miss Teapot was not a woman to be daunted for long as any difficulty, nor to sit wringing her hands and no more, while calamity was on its way. No, she was not. While the vicar dismounts and hangs his horse at the door, she found time to set all to rights as far as might be. Snatching the pipe from his beak, she seizes the astonished Mr. Teapot in a fashion quite other than her former gentle usage and leniency, and fetches away his little breeches with all speed, grasping his long neck meanwhile with her left hand, so that he could neither squawk nor hiss, but only goggle his eyes in silence, like a thief at his own hanging, so tight she held him. Then she set him down on the floor by the fire, where he stood gasping and gurgling and striving to get his breath again, while she opened the door to let the parson in. "Oh, sir," cried she, "come within. How glad am I to see you. Do come within, and sit you down in my dear husband's armchair, for he is gone to London on business of importance, and I know not if he will come back again for some weeks. Pray," says she, "do not think it strange to see this great gander in my cottage, for he is of all my flock the finest bird, and now he suffers with a cold, and so I have brought him within, and set him by the fire to medicine him. But look at him, how his eyes goggle, and how he wheezes with the cold of his chest, just like a man, forsooth." Indeed, Mr. Teapot did as she said, for he was not recovered from her rough and hasty usage, so that the vicar thought him a sick goose, and took no more notice of him than was fit in such a case. Thus did Miss Teapot cozen the good man, and he got no more of her about her absent husband for all his questions, but that he was away to London, and, as I have said, and might be long gone, but would sure return when that his business was ended. So with this and with that, Miss Teapot felt herself well settled to her new condition, and liked it well. There were no more brawls and bickerings to keep the cottage in a tumult. All was quiet now, for whenever Mr. Teapot fell in rage, with his hissings and screechings and the flapping of his great wings, would do his best to have his way, as he had tried before in his manhood, she would seize upon her broomstick, and with thwacking and belabouring drive him into a closet, and keep him close there for a good while. When she loosened him therefrom at last, after a time of no food nor drink, who so humble as he, and ready to do her bidding, if only she would give him to eat and drink? So she tamed this refractory and undocilable husband, and brought him by degrees to such a state as is proper for husbands, and the only condition to ensure a quiet household. Not only in this respect was she pleased with the new state of affairs, there was also the matter of saving expense, not only in clothes and in spending money, but in food. Though he eat, as never Goose did before, of food proper for man, yet eat as he might, he could not equal a man in this regard. Nay, could he not come with a league, so to say, of himself, Mr. Teapot, in his proper guise, for he was a notable feeder indeed. Seeing him lusty at table, whereby he every day grew fatter, until he grew the greatest gander ever seen in those parts, and, reckoned in pounds of flesh, goose grease, and feathers, added no little to her wealth. I say, seeing him thus did not discontent Miss Teapot, albeit at no time, until the happenings of which I shall tell thereafter, and she was ever minded to treat her husband in the same fashion at last as the other fowls of her raising. She did intend, to be sure, if all went well and no new change came upon him, to pluck him when the time was ripe, and as often as possible, a matter of 5 times a year if his feathers grew so. But there was no fatal intent in the good woman's mind, nor no thought of the axe. But alas, Miss Teapot, being in this state of good humour and repose, could not let well enough alone, but must needs strive to better her condition, which, to all seeming, should have been good enough. It was in this matter of expense that she found her account for betterment, and thus sowed the seeds of her undoing. Her frugal mind could not but reckon her savings, and, not satisfied, plan how they could be increased. Satisfied in the matter of his clothes, now, thinks she, if this husband of mine could be brought to relish proper goose food, then would there be so much saved. To this, then, she addressed herself with her wonted diligence. First, she began by mingling oaten meal with his breakfast more and more every day, withdrawing by little and little his eggs and bacon from the dish. So he came to eating such unused food, and at last, whether he liked it or not, ate only the same food as the rest of the fowls, whereat her heart rejoiced. Even then, if she could have stayed her hand, as might have been well, she must go further and teach him to find some portion of his food for himself, at no cost to her. To that end, she catched a great fine frog from her duck pond, and set it down on the floor before him. So strange was it to him that he eyed it with some disdain as it sat there, with its great goggle eyes blinking at him. But when it stirred and hunched itself a little with its foreleg, some goose instinct stirred too in him, and with neck outstretched and beak all a-quiver, Mr. Teapot stood fixed, as with some incantation of magic. Then it hopped, unhappy frog that it was, for it had not gone 3 hops, no, not 2, ere Mr. Teapot was upon it, and in one gulp it was gone. With this first taste of live, raw food, Mr. Teapot was blooded to this new hunting. All he could think of now was more frogs, and where to get them. For the first time since his change, he sought the society of other fowls, with which he had before been unminded to commerce. Coming among them thus, clad in his little checker breeches, he made a great stir in the fowl yard. They eyed him, askant, as a strange being, neither fowl nor man, until one wise old goose, seeing where the difference lay between them, began nipping his breeches with her beak, and tweaking them savagely. Taking their cue from her, the others set upon him, and now there was a merry enough time for all but Mr. Teapot, whose little breeches were rent and slit here and there, midst hissings and squawkings, whereof his were not the least loud, but in fear, not anger. At last he turned tail and was fain to run home to his dear wife all speed, but so sorely was he beset, even in his flight, that when he got home there was upon him but a tangle of ribbons and shreds in the stead of his prized breeches. Here again, and for the last time, she might have fended off the coming calamity, but was not wise enough to do so. Had she welcomed him with forbearance and pity for his mishap, and comforted him in his troubles with a new pair of breeches, beyond doubt he had learned his lesson, and not gone among the geese again to her loss, as we shall see. But no, intent on her plan as she was, and having her will to save all trouble with him for herself, she rips off his tatters and shoos him out again to commerce with the other fowls, as she was minded. So he went, will he, nil he, and from that time on left wearing breeches, for Miss Teapot made him no more, and so he became used to the fowls, and they to him, and treated him kindly, when he came among them in his own feathers, to seek such purchase of frogs as the pond afforded. And, being forth in the fowl yard, he eat, as did the other fowls, of the strewn corn too, and from that time eat no more at the table with his wife, much to her ease, not only as being less strange, but as saving the labor of readying his food and cleansing his basin after him. But still, he was not all Goose. Though he spent his days hankering in the fowl yard for when night fell, he would come to the cottage and sleep in their bed, and a fine warming pan he was for Miss Teapot, and a warm downy comforter into the bargain, so that she had all the use of him she wished, and was fain to have it thus. Thus, Miss Teapot came to have it all as she wished. What with peace and quiet in the house, and the saving of expense, and her own way about everything, and a husband subdued to her governance, that it was all to her mind, and so much of it of her own contriving and management too, that she vaunted herself exceedingly in her own eyes, and was sure there never had been such a clever manager as she. No, not anywhere. But her pride was, as ever, going but before her fall, for she had pushed her luck too far, as the saying is, and had forged the weapon for the destruction of her own peace of mind. It all came about with little stir at first, though it ended in tragedy dismal enough. Miss Teapot one day espied her husband walking side by side with one of her finest geese in what seemed to her too friendly fashion, no longer intent upon seeking his food and upon his quest for frogs in the pond, whereof he had become a famous hunter. He seemed now to be playing the fine gentleman, and the gay spark to this goose, turning his head and now and again to her, as if to gabble some sweet saying, or make some compliment of her beauty, ruffling it indeed, like any buck among the lady geese. Seeing this, it came into Miss Teapot's mind here, forsooth, was the making of trouble. She took the matter into her own hands with no delay, though, alas, too late at that. Driving away the goose, with a loud shooing and waving of her arms, she enticed her husband into the cottage with a tasty bit of food, for he was ever in mind of his stomach, even in the midst of his gallantries. There she made much of him, calling him her dearest husband and her sweetheart, and the like, and petting and caressing him. She chided him, too, about the goose he had been sparking. "Surely, my dear husband," says she, "it is much beneath thee to consort, and that openly before all the neighbours, with a common goose, and such a goose as that, for it is well known that she is but a saucy baggage, a trollop indeed, that she is, and not fit for the company of such a fine gentleman as thou, and my true husband into the bargain. Do not so, my dear husband, or thou wilt break the heart of thy loving wife," and much more to the same intent. But though his stomach was filled with her pampering, his ears were deaf to her entreaties. Again, she saw him in the same company, strutting like a gallant at a fair, as bold as brass, ogling his dear goose, who is indeed of all the flock the plumpest and most personable withal, and not caring though his wife saw him in such company. Again she enticed him in and renewed her entreaties. "Do but give her up," said she, "and the fowl yard too, and come back to live with me, and before, and thou shalt eat at the table of bacon and eggs, and what thou wilt, and have thy beer too, and not this raw corn and these nasty frogs, and I shall make thee a new pair of breeches, and thou shalt wear the breeches in thy own house, as the saying is." But no, it was all to no purpose, for frogs were now his only most desired food, and his dear goose his only fondness, nor were breeches prized in his eyes longer, since none wore them among his present comrades. So back to the fowl yard he goes, and to his night of love. Now was Miss Teapot's peace of mind sorely shaken, nay, it was utterly destroyed, and all of her own doing too. For now too late she saw how she had laid the traps and set the springs for her husband's downfall and her own misery by driving him from home to such company, and all for the sake of a little saving of expense and trouble in her housekeeping, that she might have her own unthwarted will in her house. That night he failed to come home of his own will at bedtime, as he had been used, nor could she persuade him to it, nor drive him in. Do all she could, but he ran this way and that, and in the end rushed upon her with crest erect, great spread of wings and angry hissing, as he would strike and wound her, so that she was fain to run before him and leave him to bed with the flock. Then indeed was poor Miss Teapot utterly cast down. "Oh," cried she, "what if he was a little trouble and expense to me, and a goose at that? He was my own true husband, and now God knows what he is, or what am I. No matter whether I loved him or he me, he was all mine, and now I must share him with a common goose, and my own fowl into the bargain." With that she fell a-crying in her lonely bed, and slept not all that night. No, not until daybreak. At long, and at last, shortly let it be said, that the miserable business came to this, that Miss Teapot saw with her own eyes, albeit nearly blinded with rage and chagrin, this saucy baggage of a goose, this trollop, who had been setting march forth on her way back to the duck pond, with a brood of 13 goslings, as proud as ever a queen with her firstborn, and beside her, strutting with all the parade of a king at the christening of his heir, who but Mr. Teapot? Who but he indeed? What followed thereupon is not meet for me to relate, lest the horrid story grieve, nay, shock the tender reader. It must be enough to tell that, shortly after, Miss Teapot bid a party of her gossips to her house to a dinner, and they all declared that they never had, no, not in all their lives, feasted upon a finer, fatter, more tender pair of fowls than was set before them. "And so the gander should be," says Miss Teapot, "for he was of the best blood, and bred up tight and cleanly, in the most tender manner, quite like a gentleman. I assure ye, though I can't say so much for the goose, which was a bit tough to my way of thinking. Miss Teapot herself, none other than she, eats so heartily of both fowls that she was seized of a surfeit, and for long her life was despaired of, but in the end she recovered and lived to a great old age. For the matter of that, she is still alive." This has been Gentleman into Goose, read by Quinn Hargrove at SnepShark on Twitter, /SnowLeopardShark on Reddit.